Hi.
Hi everyone. I'm going to share the source sheet again. Here we go. Everyone can see that. And you might want to mute your phone so otherwise we won't get interruption. Okay, so I guess as we start a new week and come to reality, come to a sense of normalcy or come to terms with the new reality after really what was a very tumultuous week last week. I know for me it was really crazy. I think we went from the beginning of the week wondering whether we should have Kiddush in the shul that Shabbos, to the week closing shul, to the end of the week realizing that I probably wasn't going to leave my house much for the next few months possibly. And my new reality, at least starting today, is I've become a childminder and a nursery teacher, having my two girls at home. So this year was put together during nap time this afternoon. So, please bear with me. It's a little undercooked. I have to say my mother in Jewish history and smicha didn't really prepare me for this new vacation. I'm pleased, at least in the evenings, to be getting back to, I guess, what I'd usually my professional life and devote my life to. So it's really a pleasure and thanking you for coming online and joining me as we learn through together. As we find ourselves in these strange times as Jews, our reality and our normalcy is the weekly Torah portion, learning the Torah portion of the coming Shabbat and delving into its issues and its topics. And if anything, now more than ever, when we aren't going to lay the Seder in Shul, we aren't going to gather together on the Shabbos morning and read through the parasha. It's all the more important, I think, to keep this cycle going. I don't know when in the last 2,000 years someone's been reading parasha in Shul. Has there ever been a time in the world, I don't know if there's still some shuls open, have there ever been a time where Jews haven't come to Shul and somewhere the parasha is being read? Maybe this is the first time in Jewish history. So at least let's try to keep it going by learning in our own time, by not forgetting what the weekly parasha is. And last week we finished the second book of the Torah, the book of Shomrei, and this week we begin the third book, the book of Vayikra, the middle book of the Torah. Rabbi Sachs writes in his introduction to his Covenant and Conversation, the book, he argues that in terms of sort of a structure, it's really the middle is the most important. You have sort of two leading up, the middle is the high point, and then two leading down. Somehow it's this middle book of the Torah which is often the most misunderstood. It's the shortest of all the 5 books of the Torah. It's the most enigmatic, yet perhaps the most crucial. And the key theme of this week's parasha and the following week's parasha, and really throughout the Sefer Vayikra, is the topic of korbanot, the topic of sacrifices, specifically the animal sacrifices that were brought on the altar, on the Mizbeach, firstly in the Mishkan, and later on in the Beit Mikdash, in the Beis HaMikdash in Jerusalem. And it's a very, very difficult topic indeed. And hence, as we'll see, the commentators, the Rishonim, the medieval commentators, are primary keys into understanding much of Torah, have very, very different approaches to how korbanot work and what they're all about. Because, definitely to us, in the 21st century, animal sacrifice is a very, very distant and strange phenomenon. We would see it somewhat primitive if someone was today take an animal and sacrifice it in ritual purposes, which is more than strange, if not somewhat barbaric. Okay, it's not human sacrifice, which is definitely barbaric, although that will continue to be, as we know, in Aztec and in South American societies till not many centuries ago. Nonetheless, korbanot is it's difficult for us to wrap our heads around. Nonetheless, it's a key element of Judaism. So let's study together and see how our major commentators deal with it from the medieval period right down to the modern day. So we start with the Ramban. So Nachmanides, if you look on the source sheet, Nachmanides, again, we mentioned him, I think, last night, wrote a major commentary on the Torah. Really is after Rashi. Everyone knows Rashi. Rashi is the commentary to the Torah, which is studied by everyone when we read, learning through the Torah. The Ramban is probably second to that. And in his introduction to the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, he writes, this book, and he does this at the beginning of all the books, we call it one thing. We call it Vayikra, or we call it, Bamidbar, the books we give to it, but there's also another name. Every book has another name, and that is, he says, the Torah's Kohanim v'Halavim, where Leviticus actually comes from. It's the book of the laws of the Kohanim and the Levites. And in it we explain all the matters of the sacrifices, not just the sacrifices, but the entire enterprise of the Mishkan, the Mishmeret, the guarding of and the functioning of the Mishkan. Because the previous book was the book of exile and redemption, the Exodus from Egypt, and it concludes with the matter of the tent of meeting, the creation, fashioning, and erecting of the tent of meeting of the Mishkan, and God's presence that fills that tabernacle. Therefore, now we move on to Tzivahu b'Karbonos. God now commands us about the sacrifices, the service that we're going to do in that Mishkan, in that tabernacle, of Shmiras HaMishkan, how to guard it, how to safeguard it, how to maintain it as that supremely holy place. And then he writes, Sheyu HaKarbonos kapara lahem. What is the primary purpose of these sacrifices? Kapara lahem. It's to serve as an atonement. Basically, the karbonos are really part of the safeguarding of the Mishkan itself, meaning they're not the ends of the Mishkan. The Mishkan, the tabernacle, is really primarily about being a dwelling for God, a place, the tent of meeting, that meeting between who? Between the Jewish people and God's presence itself. And the karbonos are simply a tactic, they are simply the way in which we ensure that God's presence remains in the confines of the Mishkan. It's our way when we mess things up. It's the Jewish people's roses, in a relationship. When someone's done something wrong, you bring them roses, or you give them a gift to try to placate them, to try to rekindle the strength of the relationship. So too, we had the Mishkan, we have that relationship, we have that shared home with God, but sometimes as human beings, we're going to mess up. So we have the opportunity to bring karbanot, to bring these sacrifices in order to rectify, in order to gain kapara, to gain atonement. And therefore God commands the Kohanim, who are going to be the people, who are going to function in that Mishkan, that they should remain holy after all time. And he goes on to say that within the confines of the Mishkan, so he says there's two elements, there's two themes to the book of Vayikra, the Karbanot and the Mishmeres HaMishkan, how the Mishkan was safeguarded, how they maintained and ensured that people who were not supposed to be there didn't come there. Why is that? Because he's similar to Mount Sinai. Just as when God came down on Mount Sinai to give the Torah, to reveal himself to the masses, to the entirety of the Jewish people, Moshe is told before even the giving of the Torah that he has to somehow barricade the mountain, he has to put a fence around it and sanctify it, meaning holiness, sanctification comes when there's boundaries, when there's limitations. Not everyone can ascend the mountain, only those who are worthy, i.e. Moshe at the top, and Aaron and the elders and those who are worthy. So it was with there's different levels in the Mishkan. You have the holies of holies, only the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, goes into. Then you have the precinct, the area where the Kohanim serve from. And finally, you have a boundary. You have an outer wall where the rest of the people cannot encroach further. Again, it's this parallel, and this is the theme of Ramban Nachmanides, that the Mishkan is a moving Sinai experience. We have that experience of meeting God at Sinai, of receiving the Torah. How are we going to maintain that? How are we going to promulgate that? The idea is create a Mishkan. The Mishkan is your moving, your roving Sinai experience. Just as a Sinai, there had to be guards, there had to be limitation where people could encroach, so it is with the Mishkan. So the Ramban, and we'll come back to the Ramban's comments later in Vayikra, it's quite a lofty idea of what karbonos are about. Here we see karbonos are about achieving atonement to maintain God's presence within the confines of the tabernacle. All right, we're good with that? The other extreme is Rambam. So Maimonides, again, living not so different time than Nachmanides, a little bit before actually, he takes a very, very different approach, an approach which is actually somewhat famous, which is somewhat well known. And he begins in chapter 32 of the third part of Guide for the Perplexed Mora Nevuchim and says, if you think about it, the way God creates us as humans and the way God leads history is a process. A child isn't born complete, isn't born a fully formed human being. There's a gestation period. Through the 9 months, the limbs, the bones, everything grows and is formed, and so too the child grows. And so it is with nations, and with history, and with societies. There is a progression. Societies, yes, says the Maimonides, societies progress, they get better. A time in a discussion for another time, but perhaps that's the basis. But you could say, even though the Torah we discussed yesterday, in conjunction to Pesach and the idea of slavery, we talked about the halachas of slavery. The truth is, we don't have slavery nowadays in halacha, and you could understand that. No, if the Torah has an idea of slavery, that means in the Torah's moral system, slavery is okay. Slavery is maybe even something to be celebrated, and we just, whatever, for technical reasons we don't have it. But many take the approach that not. Slavery was a concession for the times, correct? At the time of the giving of the Torah, that was a reality in the world. But God hoped that society would progress. There's no commandment to have a slave. It's now that people do have slaves, the Torah has a set of laws how to deal with them, how to treat them. But the Torah hopes that society, that humanity will progress further and, come to an age and come to a time when indeed we don't have slaves anymore. Says Rambam, that's true in everything. And Rambam says that's the same here with korbanos. If you read Rambam in the source sheet, many precepts in our laws are a result of a similar course adopted by the same supreme being. It is namely impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. It is therefore, according to the nature of man, impossible for him to suddenly discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. So look, skip a few lines and look at the underlined lines. But the custom which was in those days general amongst all men, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up. Remember, the Israelites had just left Egypt. They were within a few months of leaving an Egyptian society where, as Rambam continues, consisted in sacrificing animals in those temples which contain certain images, to bow down to those images and to burn incense before them. Religious and aesthetic person were in those days the persons that were devoted to the service in the temples erected to the stars, as has been explained by us. It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God, says the Rambam, as displayed in the whole creation, that he did not command us to give up and to discontinue all these manners of service. For to obey such a commandment, it would have been contrary to the nature of man, who generally cleaves to that which he is used to. What is Rambam saying in other words? The Israelites, the Jewish people at that time, had lived for centuries in a society mired and knee-deep in idolatry. That is what Egypt had. It was a land of the gods. Pharaoh was the sun god. It's a land of polytheism, of a idolatrous society. Says the Rambam, it would have been impossible to expect the Jewish people, a nation of slaves, and this is not a highly high intellectual, highbrow people. This was a slave nation, to move from one day to the next, from being polytheistic and idolatrous to being purely monotheistic and having no inclination, having no desire, having no want to serve their God, their new God, their monotheistic God in the same way, in the same manner, using the same forums as they had done in the past. So famously, worded in a different way, for Rambam, korbanot, animal sacrifices, is all about weaning the Jewish people off pagan worship, that eventually, indeed, they'll come to serve God without the need of the animal sacrifice, without that medium, which for Rambam, I understand, has its roots in pagan worship. And indeed, when King Shlomo HaMelech, Solomon, builds the temple, and he gives this whole speech in chapter 8 of Kings, he gives this beautiful, eloquent speech. It's a prayer, really. It's his inauguration speech of the temple. He doesn't speak about sacrifice. He asks the question, how is it that God will come to dwell, this infinite God will come to dwell in the confines of a physical home? But then he goes on to speak about how it becomes a place of prayer not only for Jews. It actually is a very universalistic vision for King Shlomo. It's a place where all people will come to pray. It's really focused on prayer and that connection between humanity and God, really without, lishmoya l'orina ve'latfila. It's the place that God listens to the arena, to the song and to the prayer, which is one of the motifs of first night slichos, is actually taken from the verses of King Shlomo's prayer of his inauguration of the temple. Speaks nothing of sacrifice, but speaks of prayer. Because for Rambam that makes sense. On the highest level, on the ideal level, the way we serve God, avodah, one of the three pillars the world stands on, Torah, avodah, gemulas, chasadim. Avodah is prayer. It's not that prayer somehow is only a supplement for sacrifice, but prayer is the ideal, and sacrifice was somehow an intermediary necessity that ancient man needed to wean him off idolatry. Similar, but a little bit different. Comes to the same point, but actually from quite a different angle. Rambam, a few chapters later, in chapter 46 of part 3 of the Guide to the Perplexed, writes as follows in the bottom of page 1. Scripture tells us, according to the version of Unclus, that the Egyptians worshipped Arius, and therefore abstained from killing sheep, and held shepherds in contempt, because here are these people who are dealing and looking after the god. Why the gods don't need a shepherd? Behold, and then he wrote a verse. And he says, some sects among the Sabians worship demons and imagine that these assume the forms of goats. They call them therefore goats, Seirim. The worship was widespread, and perhaps that's what when we talk about on Yom Kippur, the So'ela Azazel, that they would send off a sacrifice into the desert, and the Nachmanides, I spoke about this last year on Shabbos Shuvah, the Drasha for Shabbos Shuvah, the sending the goat La Seirim, La Shedim, to the Seirim god. Interesting Rambam, but again we see the idea that the goat was a god at the time. And he says, for this reason, these sects abstain from eating goat's flesh. Most idolaters have objected to killing cattle, holding that species of animal to great estimation. Therefore, the people of Hodu, Indians, up to this day, do not slaughter cattle, even in those countries where other animals are slaughtered. Again, different societies, different nations, different religions have different gods, and he's saying they all had animal gods. They didn't just. There were times and there were societies that had gods which took different forms, whether it was forces in nature or Greek gods, where the Greek goddess is very, very different. He's saying there was a time and places where the gods were animals. And therefore, in order to eradicate these false principles, really it's a subversion, it's to undermine the whole idea of animal gods, the law commanded us to offer sacrifices only to these three kinds. And it's against these, it's specifically the type of animals which were served as gods. That's the type of animals that God commanded us to bring as karbanot. Not every animal could bring as a karbanot. We begin Vayikra with its very specific cattle, very specific sheep, cattle, goats, and so domesticated animal, birds. Specific animals are brought as karbanot. And Rambam is saying it's because it's somehow a subversion of animal sacrifices of serving these animals at the time, of not sacrificing, specifically not killing and honoring these animals. Therefore, karbonet is a subversion, again, a weaning off, and it's a way to counterbalance the idolatrous ways of the age. Okay, and what's interesting is Rambam is often taken as sort of an outlier. It's quite extreme. As we'll see, Ramban Nachmanides' rejection has quite strong questions on him, both theologically and from sources. But the truth is, in a way, Rambam has an older source on his side. I don't bring it for you to save time, but it's actually a Medrash Rabbah in Vayikra. Notice that I spelled this wrong. A Medrash Rabbah in Vayikra that says a similar thing, that the whole purpose of sacrifices is as an antidote to idolatry, to the idols of the time. Ramban, however, takes a very different approach. Firstly, he asked a question from Noach. Noach leaves the ark, the ship, him and his family after the flood. What do? Noach brings sacrifices. And we're told, God smells the smell of the sacrifices. And it's that same wording actually we use in this week's parasha. That the sacrifices should be as a sweet-smelling odor to God, somehow something which finds favor in God's eyes. So seemingly, already in the time of Noach, we have sacrifices and animal sacrifices. And in Noach's age, Noach was, according to our tradition, he was the only survivor of the flood. There isn't an issue of idolatry. That whole society, that whole generation had been wiped out. So it's difficult to say Noach had korbanot, had animal sacrifices, to wean us off idolatry. And another example is Cain and Hevel, right at the earliest dawns of history. Cain and Abel are bringing sacrifices to God, are bringing animal sacrifices to God. Again, says Nachmanides, questioning Maimonides, difficult to say that's just to do with idolatry. So, and he brings other examples that we have many sources that seem to extol the virtue, that speak of the greatness of sacrifices. It's difficult to say that the whole enterprise is simply to somehow, it's simply putting, it's simply a way to placate the needs of that ancient generation. Rather, he says as follows. Rather, if you follow the curse in the middle of the paragraph of the Ramban, the reason they show person's actions, a person's behavior is really driven by three aspects. On the one hand, we have thought. We think about what we're going to do. We have a thought process. We have piv. We have dibur. We speak. And b'maisa, we have the physical, actual act. So therefore, a korban, which is to achieve atonement for our negative acts, our negative thoughts, our negative speech, and each and every korban, there's these three elements to counterbalance these three levels, these three different parts of human behavior, of human nature, with which we sin. Therefore, he says the owner places their hands on the head of the animal. There's a sense of physical action. There's a verbal confession, like we say in Yom Kippur. There's a verbal confession, like I've sinned, I've transgressed, using one's mouth. Okay, and you burn the innards of the animal. That corresponds to the level of thought. Okay, so that's one idea. The Ramban. The sacrifice somehow is to counterbalance in the actions of that sacrifice, which are to bring atonement. They counterbalance all the different levels, all the different aspects of this sin. And finally, on the bottom line, he says, the bottom line is, Karbanot, animal sacrifices, have a sod ne'elam. There's a great hidden secret. Ultimately, they aren't simply, as the Rambam argues, a practical placation of idolatrous needs. There's a deep spiritual secret in them. Just interestingly, to answer up for the Rambam, Moshe Chachma, who was with Meir Simcha of Devinsk, one of the great rabbis of earliest 20th century Europe, he answers that perhaps for Rambam, when Rambam writes that animal sacrifices, karbanot, were a way to placate, to be a stand-in for idolatrous practices, that's only talking about a bomber, meaning private altars. Before the temple, so not in the time of the Mishkan, but once the people got to the land of Israel, before they built the temple, they were allowed private altars. On those private altars, they could bring certain sacrifices, definitely not all the range of sacrifices. They could bring certain private sacrifices. Perhaps that indeed was to fulfill the needs, to fulfill the urge of a nation still accustomed and still trying to mimic idolatrous practices. However, the karbanot, the Beit HaMikdash, talking about the sacrifices in the temple itself, that is different. That is of a much holier essence, that is of a much more sublime character, and that indeed perhaps would, even according to Rambam, would fall into the Nachmanidean type of approach, that karbanos have a much more lofty purpose. Nefesh HaChaim, taking perhaps even a step further, a step deeper, a step higher, writes, Nefesh HaChaim was Chaim Volozhiner, the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva in, not the founder of the Volozhin Yeshiva, it was really a precursor. He was the student, so really his grand student, set up the Volozhin Yeshiva. He was a student of the Gra, the primary student of the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon didn't really write a huge amount. Nefesh HaChaim, the work written by Rav Chaim Volozhiner, became a classic in Jewish thought in the early modern period. And he writes as follows: it was through the sacrifices in the temple. The sacrifices in the temple are a mirroring, are a sort of a copying of what goes on in the higher echelons of the spiritual worlds. And therefore, he says the whole thing is really had a very deep and sublime spiritual dimension to it. And quite simply, he quotes the Zohar, quite simply, the karbanot, even though to us it looks quite physical and gory and sacrificing animals and slaughtering them and sprinkling blood. He says it all has a deep, deep symbolism corresponding to what goes on in the world above. Okay, that's the two main approaches, Rambam and Ramban. Let's move to the modern period in the last few minutes we have, and to give two approaches suggested by Rav Soloveitchik and by Rav Hirsch, which I think go beyond trying to rationalize and trying to understand korbanot in their own right, but trying to apply it to us. What is korbanot? What is sacrifice meant to me, to us? How is it supposed to apply to us today as religious people? So the Rav Soloveitchik writes, is quoted, this is a quote from his book, Community Covenant and Commitment. His book, again, much of the writings from Soloveitchik, they've collated, they've taken transcripts or things he'd written and not published. This is a book actually of letters. A lot of his letters he wrote to different people, they collated it about 10, 15 years ago in a book. And this is now quoted in his Chumash. He writes as follows: the precept of sacrifice is a central motif in Judaism. To live in accord with God's word, actually, I've got this as a little bit clearer somewhere else. So I'm gonna bring it up here because it'll be much clearer for you. So let me just stop sharing. Let me share it as something else. Where can I share? Yeah, share screen. I'm going to share with you from here. Yeah, can people see that now? Maybe a bit clearer. Yeah. When a man amongst us, he writes, the precept of sacrifice is a central motif in Judaism. To live in accord with God's word is identical with living a sacrificial life. To act morally is synonymous with sacrificial action. God summoned man into his sacrificial service. What was man called upon to sacrifice? Judaism gives a straightforward answer to the basic theological and ethical question. Man must offer everything he possesses. Nothing is to be spared, and nothing is to be saved for man. The logic of this answer is self-evident. The sacrificial action consists in restoring that which man heretofore considered his own to his rightful owner, returning to the master that which was entrusted to man's care, and of which he erroneously and impudently took possession. Since there is nothing within the reach of man which he does not have in trust for and from God, there is nothing whose return to God would not be considered a hallowed sacrificial service. Must man return to the master of the universe not only all he possesses in the form of physical goods, but himself as well, his body, mind, and spirit, soul, the whole of his existence in all its boundless manifestation at all levels. So for Soloveitchik, sacrifice comes, animal sacrifices, it's just a subdivision, it's just part of the need for man in his service to God to sacrifice completely. That all we have and everything that we are, our entire existence, is in thanks to him, is dependent on him, is really owed to him, and therefore to be a proper religious individual, to be actually a free person, he argues somewhere else, is to be able to sacrifice, to surrender to God, and to be willing to give everything up for him. And of course, animal sacrifice, taking our money, buying something which has significance, which has a decent amount of worth and a value, and giving that to him in a ceremony, that is just an expression, that is just perhaps an example of what we're willing to do and to sacrifice to him. And he writes, very interesting in the next, if you continue, that he says, even though Judaism abhors human sacrifice, the idea of child sacrifice, which was again common in the ancient world, nonetheless, he says there's something actually at the root of that, something in that which actually is still true in Judaism. Obviously not sacrificing the human being, but rather the primitive, brutal cult of perpetuating, murdering, and extinguishing the physical existence of man in honor of God is pagan and abominable. Yet the offering of the spiritual personality of the human metaphysical existence to God is a great heroic act, in which Judaism believes man finds his unique charismatic fulfillment. And he goes on to say that it's really when a person, gives charity, and then they have to go the extra mile, where it starts to actually hurt, and it hits their pocket. And it's not just easy, it actually hurts. He says that's really what true giving is. And it's in that type of giving, he should spend his hard-earned money on others. It is then that the act of giving becomes a great sacrifice. For by doing so, the donor renounces his mastery over his wealth, retreating from his economic position of strength. I.e., sacrifice is giving when it hurts, when it's difficult for us, and in giving when it's difficult for us. And when it hurts us, we're really giving of ourselves, what we would rightfully think is ours, and we give that over to God, or we give that over to somebody else. That's what sacrifice is. I'm willing to forego on something which is fundamental to me, with something which I need. And that is what we're called upon as religious beings. That is what the root of Karbanot is an example of the ability to sacrifice, to be able to willing to forego and to give up everything for God. In the last minute or two, let me just share with you Shomrei Harsh. He takes a slightly different approach, but again, something which applies to us today without the need to actually sacrifice animals per se. Again, something which has pertinence for us. What's the Karban? He writes, it is most regrettable that we have no word which really reproduces the idea which lies in the expression of Karban. So we use this Hebrew word Karban, sacrifice, but it really doesn't do justice to what the word means. The unfortunate use of the word sacrifice implies the idea of giving something up that is of value to oneself for the benefit of another, as Vayikra wrote, or of having to do without something of value. Ideas which are not only entirely absent from the nature and idea of a Karban, but are diametrically opposed to it. Okay, so he's taking a different approach from Vayikra. Also, the underlying idea of the offering makes it by no means an adequate expression for Karban. An offering means I'm offering you something. It's nice, it's pleasant, it's noble, but it doesn't perhaps capture what Karban are really about. Also, the underlying idea of the idea of an offering goes on. One cannot get away from the idea of a gift, a present, but the idea of Karban is far away from all of this. It is never used for a present or gift. It is used exclusively with reference to man's relation to God, and can only be understood from the meaning which lies at its root, karev. The word Karban, which we use as sacrifice, comes from the Hebrew word karav, which means close. Karav means to approach, to come near, and so to get into close relationship with somebody. This at once must positively give the idea of the object and purpose of hakrava, of offering up a sacrifice, as the attainment of a higher sphere of life. It thus rejects both the idea of a sacrifice, of giving something up, of losing something. Meaning he's saying a Karban, meaning I'm offering, I'm sacrificing something, is quite the opposite if you think about it, of what he's saying a Karban should achieve. A Karban shouldn't be divorcing something from myself, giving something up. It's actually bringing something close. It's attaching myself tightly to something else. So he writes, as well as it being a requirement of the one who gets near, as he shows the Makriv, the one who has to find what he requires in the Karban. Okay, he goes on to explain the idea of Kirvas Elokim, closeness to God, what the idea of a Karban. Yes, we achieve it through bringing up a sacrifice on the temple, but that is just the ceremony. And again, you have to come back to Rambam or Ramban. What is the meaning in that act itself of bringing up an animal in a ceremonious ritual act in the temple? But what the Shomrei Harsh is saying, at its roots, at its depth, it's all about hakravot. The word means it's about drawing close. It's about building relationship. That's how God has told us how we should do it. It's the idea of Karban hakravot. We're building and bridging that gap between us and the divine. We're creating a closeness, and that is indeed ultimately what we're striving for. It's what our ideal is. Kirvas Elokim Tov, the pasuk in Tehillim, the verse in Tehillim tells us closeness to God is what's good, i.e., what a Jew is striving for is that cleaving, is that closeness, is that meaningful and deep relationship with God. And hence that, according to Shomrei Harsh, that's at least one aspect. He has a lot on Karbana, a lot on sacrifices. In the beginning, the first few verses in his commentary on Vayikra are really, really a magisterial dealing and treatment of the subject. I think this is the salient point. The idea of a Karban is just the medium through which we create that closeness, that relationship with God. And today that's obviously supposed to be done through prayer. Prayer is the replication and the replacement of Karbanah, of sacrifice. By offering prayer, the prayerful act is, of course, it's just the medium to create relationship, to have that communion and that conversation with God. So we've seen various approaches to this major theme of our book of Vayikra and to our parsha, which deals solely with the various sacrifices brought in the temple. I hope that was illuminating, that was somewhat meaningful. And please God, we will be together, we will meet up again on this forum. I know people probably wanted to go to see what the Prime Minister has to announce. But I'm here. People want to unmute, ask any questions. Tomorrow night, we just put out on our Facebook group, I don't know, WhatsApp group, people go out to others. Maybe I can share it with you right now, actually, so you can see the poster for our learning sessions. So tomorrow we have oh, sorry, I shouldn't have screen share. Tomorrow we have Rabbi Moshe Freeman is going to be giving a session on prayer. And on Wednesday, we have Haggadah highlights, a session sharing some ideas, highlights of Haggadah. And you'll see we set out the next sessions for the rest of the week. So hopefully we'll see you all there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.